Hi there and welcome to the first episode of my 10-minute moan for today. And the topic of this 10-minute moan is proof that our government, our media and even our police force have been gaslighting us over this far-right narrative that they've been driving. Now the first thing to tell you is what's actually going on here and how have the government, the judiciary and the media reacted to it. Well, there's a big, massive chunk of people in the United Kingdom who have got concerns. Not necessarily concerns with immigrants, but concerns with the amount of immigration. Not necessarily concerns with asylum seekers, but concerns over the illegal importation of asylum seekers to our country. People have got concerns about housing, and most recently, due to the almost fatal stabbing of a soldier in uniform in our streets and three beautiful young girls going to a summer camp, the murder of those three girls, there are loads of people in the country who are concerned about knife crime. And a couple of days, I think it might even 24 hours after the murder of those three little girls, we saw a pitched battle in the streets of Southend by numerous young men wielding machetes. We've seen footage, but not in the mainstream, because that won't happen. You'll see it in likes of Twitter that they're trying to shut down, right? You'll see loads of footage with people who are apparently on anti-racism counter-protests carrying weaponry, openly carrying weaponry around our streets. Now, these are in no way to try and excuse some acts of thuggery that have taken place by people who have been protesting. But these stories are always reported by the mainstream and looked after by the judiciary and moaned about by our government. But the other things I told you about, they very seldom see light of day. Certainly can't remember too many comments from Kier Starmer about the other topics that I've described. So that's what's happening in the country. We've got a lot of people with genuine, valid concerns. Now, I've already said in a previous video, when this happened 4 years ago with the Black Lives Matter protests, which led to violence and destruction, we were told we had to listen to the protesters and what they were actually saying and come up with ways of making them happier. The complete opposite is happening this time when the nation has concerns. We have been gaslit by telling us they are far right, and I'll prove that in just a minute, how I can actually say that with something to back it up. So what we're getting told now is these protesters, their concerns don't matter because we labelled them far right. When we've seen 72-year-old women, for God's sake, arrested in the street for turning up at Downing Street during a protest. Her only crime appears to have been she was in a place that was due, I think it's a section 60 when they say a place has got to be cleared by a certain time of night, and she seems to have overstepped the time of that. That seems to be her only crime. How you can define someone with the clips that we've seen on TV as being far right from that footage alone is bizarre. So that's what's happening, right? And everybody who has these concerns is now labelled by our government, our judiciary and our media as far right, regardless if there's any truth in that at all. So I have said I can prove that. The proof was all there yesterday and over the last 24 hours due to the 100 fake protests that were never happening. Now this story was spoke about by police, by the government and by the media, who all jumped onto this narrative that we were expecting to have 100 far-right protests on Wednesday. And that led to about 30 counter-protests, unchallenged counter-protests, because there was no far-right protest ever happening, if you even want to call it far-right. There's no concerned citizens wanting to take to the street on a Wednesday night in 100 cities up and down the country. It just was never going to happen. Newspapers printed maps and named the cities that these fake protests were meant to be taking place. So the counter-protests, which were evidently arranged by trade unions and quangos, etc., if you just need any proof of that, you just need to look at the footage and the banners that were supplied. Okay, these were well organised things. And those photographs were what we woke up to yesterday in the mainstream media. Now, the reason that that's proof that this whole thing's a narrative that's a false narrative is very simple. They described them as far right without even having any proof in what they were in the first place. Now, if the ADL was still a thing, which apparently it isn't, and they had arranged a protest for Wednesday, then yeah, I can understand why somebody would say, oh, there's a Facebook post saying that the ADL are going to Stockport on Wednesday at 6 o'clock. And if anybody wanted to say that that was a far-right protest happening on Wednesday at 6 o'clock, you could kind of understand how they would get to that by joining the dots. But when there was no protest whatsoever, what proof did these people, the judiciary, the government, and the media have that they were far-right? It's impossible to have a far-right protest that's not happening at all. There is no protest. But they all jumped on the narrative, even when there was no protests happening at all. Willingly jumped on the narrative. The judiciary, the government, and the media. And that's farcical. Because this is communism. That's what it looks like. Right? It's just ridiculous. So what we've done in the week since these three girls were horrifically murdered on our streets is managed to vilify and condemn all these people from having these thoughts and concerns. Immigration illegally, asylum seekers, housing, knife crime. Ignored. There's not one single thing been done since these protests started. There's not been one discussion how to remedy these things and actually take on board the concerns of the nation. Now, if that's the case, then there is no end to this. Well, there is an end to it. The people that you describe as far right, the only way this can finish peacefully is if they just shut up, sit down and know their place, because that's what's going on here. Now, I've spent a bit of time over the last few months actually on X Spaces on Twitter. They're quite enjoyable places, a lot of good discussion in the run-up to the British election, etc. And obviously a lot of discussion about current affairs. And I was part of a conversation that was reported to the police. And the host of that X Space was invited to his local police station after a complaint to suggest that it was inciting violence, which was a bit bizarre. Anyway, this gentleman went to his local police station at their invitation and voluntarily, and thankfully took the no comment narrative. But it appears that during his interview they were trying to get him to say things about, what do you feel about the protests? What do you feel about politics? All this stuff to try and draw information out of him because, in their own words, there was no criminality in his space. However, the way they were questioning him, it was evident they were trying to get some information out of him that they could then use to crucify him in some other way. And although there was no criminality, he was advised that they will now begin through every single social media post that he's ever made to see if there's any criminality in them. So although the reported crime, there's no criminality, that's not the end of the story. And that's the way anybody with a discerning voice is being treated. There is lots of similar voices on the other side of this argument, but it takes you to actually say we need to slash their throats before we see any type of criminality being investigated. And we still don't know if that man's been charged. We know he was arrested, but I've not heard if he's been charged yet or not. This is a Labour councillor, obviously. Oh, and a trade union man, which we'll come on to later on. So that's the society we live in. And we're now being told that if you suggest that there's two-tier policing, that could be a criminal activity as well. But when you consider that a man who rightly, in one of these far-right protests, punched a police officer, was arrested and charged, went to court, and the whole process was sped up because he pled guilty, and he's been sentenced to a custodial sentence. That's how someone who attacks a police officer at these protests is dealt with. But it's now over a week, going on a fortnight, since we saw the horrific incident in Manchester Airport, where, I need to be honest with you, it looks as if two parties have been involved in some criminality. But the two brothers in that situation have still not been charged. There's been no charge brought against them. So you could argue, well, when you, and I've seen this argument, when you go to court and you claim that you're guilty, then, or admit your guilt, you get sentenced right away. I know that, I'm well aware of that. But these two people, you need to run an order as arrest, charged, go to court, and if convicted, sentenced. There is no need for the bit in the middle between being arrested and charged to be far greater for someone doing something in one situation and two people doing the same thing in another situation. That is why people suggest there is two-tier policing, because the evidence is there in front of it. But the police, the media, and our government don't want to hear that either. So it's just another way of quelling anybody that's not going to just repeat the government's narrative on any subject. And that scares me, because democracy, we should be better than that. We should have a level playing field for everybody. And another thing that's become very evident since the removal of a Tory government is trade unions. These trade unions that wanted to protest and strike at the drop of a hat at the end of the Tory reign. I mean, we had public sector workers demanding 25% pay increases, or they would go out and strike. Very highly paid jobs. I know transport network, there was a lot of confusion over that, because train drivers are paid quite a lot of money and people that work ticket offices, etc. weren't. But some of the demands we had, the trade union movement on these things, was a bit bizarre, if you remember rightly, when it was a Tory government. Now we have a Labour government, and the counter-protests, the woke, cuddly, acceptable ones, have a look at the banners that are on display and the placards. Things like the Social Workers' Party, which is just a communist movement, heavily involved in it, and unions. Quite a lot of unions have got banners at these protests. And that's no accident. And the actual trade union movement is starting to really, I've never been, I've been in unions before when I was younger, and I was working in large work areas and stuff, but trade unions are becoming a bit redundant, really. I'm not saying we shouldn't have them, but if you think of the amount of them that we've got and what they actually do, they seem to create things to justify their existence. Very similar to the Stonewall situation, who done a job for the lesbian gay community. Kind of that was it, and there wasn't really anything left for them to do, so they suddenly went into other things like trans, etc., and that whole thing blew up. The trade unions are massive in industry in its own. But the fact they're now jumping in this bandwagon to go out and protest every Saturday with their union members' money, I find a bit distasteful, if I'm honest with you. And the only difference between the left and the right, and I'll not use far left and far right, I don't like these words, but the only difference between left and right is the left are somewhat better funded and better organised. And the right seem a wee bit more ad hoc and more instantaneous, more reactionary. And that's why, from a PR point of view, the left's an easier sell. And that's why they seem to be winning this war. But there we go, folks. For a good old moan for me. If you've enjoyed the moan, give me a thumbs up, please. Let other people see it by doing that. That helps fantastically. You can subscribe if you've not already done so, and hit the notification bell. But most importantly of all, let's hear these people demonising the good middle ground in UK politics and population. Let's hear people demonising them by calling them things like far right and fascists. Everyone else, have a great day. Cheerio, bye now.